The day had been unremarkable, just another quiet evening in the small town of Willow Creek, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names and life moved at a pace slow enough to make you forget there was a world beyond its borders. For Sarah, it was home. She sat on the porch of her modest house, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air smelled faintly of pine trees from the nearby woods, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil after yesterday's rain. It should have been peaceful, but tonight felt different. Her younger brother, Ethan, leaned against the railing, scrolling through his phone. His headphones were plugged in, but she could still hear the faint hum of music leaking out. He glanced up briefly when he noticed her staring. "What?" he asked, pulling one earbud free. "Nothing," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "Just thinking." Ethan smirked. "You're always thinking. You need to relax more." She smiled faintly but didn't respond. Instead, she looked past him toward the darkening sky. Something about the twilight made her uneasy. The colors seemed off too deep, too sharp. Purples bled into reds, and shadows stretched unnaturally long across the yard. Even the crickets chirping in the distance sounded wrong, too loud, too rhythmic, almost mechanical. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, rattling branches and sending leaves spiraling onto the porch. Sarah shivered despite herself. "Did you feel that?" she murmured. "Feel what?" Ethan said absently, already distracted by whatever meme he'd found online. "It's like..." She hesitated, unsure how to put it into words. "Like the air is heavier tonight." Ethan rolled his eyes. "You've been watching too many horror movies again, haven't you?" Sarah forced a laugh, though it came out hollow. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was imagining things. After all, nothing ever happened here. Not really. Just the occasional power outage, or stray dog wandering into someone's backyard. Life in Willow Creek wasn't exactly thrilling. But then her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out and frowned at the screen. A notification flashed across the display, an emergency alert. "What the hell?" Ethan said, leaning over to read the message. "That's weird. What does unidentified signal even mean?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her heart began to race, pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape. Emergency alerts weren't uncommon. They usually warned about storms or road closures, but this one felt personal, like it was meant for them specifically. Before either of them could say anything else, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they went out completely, plunging the street into darkness. Across the neighborhood, porch lights blinked off, one by one, until only the cold glow of the moon illuminated the scene. "Great," Ethan muttered sarcastically. "Power's out. Guess we're breaking out the candles." But Sarah didn't move. She stared at her phone, which now displayed a blank screen. Dead. No battery left. No signal. Nothing. And yet moments ago, it had worked perfectly fine. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, a low, droning hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated in her chest, making her teeth ache. Ethan froze mid-step, his expression shifting from annoyance to confusion. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Sarah nodded slowly, clutching the edge of the porch railing for support. The noise grew louder, deeper, until it filled the entire space around them. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. Silence fell like a heavy curtain, smothering everything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there, frozen, listening to the absence of noise, until Ethan broke the silence. "Okay, this is officially creepy." Sarah opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, something caught her eye. Down the street, at the edge of the tree line, a figure stood silhouetted against the dim light of the moon, tall, thin, motionless. Watching them, her breath hitched. "Ethan," she whispered hoarsely, "don't turn around." The silence after the power outage was suffocating. Sarah's phone remained dead, no matter how many times she pressed the power button or shook it in frustration. Ethan fiddled with his own device, muttering under his breath as he tried to get a signal. "This doesn't make sense," he said finally, looking up at her. "Even if the power's out, our phones shouldn't just die like that." Sarah didn't respond. Her eyes were still fixed on the figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It hadn't moved not once, but something about its posture felt wrong. Too tall, too thin, and those shadows around it, they seemed darker than the night itself. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the trees. Ethan squinted into the distance but shook his head. "See what?" "There's nothing there." But there was. She could feel it watching them, its presence pressing against her skin like an invisible weight. A chill ran down her spine despite the warm evening air. "It's right there," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. "At the edge of the woods." Ethan frowned, glancing between her and the trees. "Are you sure you're not imagining things?" Before she could answer, another sound cut through the stillness, a low, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Only louder, closer. The noise echoed from somewhere behind the house. "What is that?" Ethan asked, his tone sharper now. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, gripping the railing tightly. "But I think we should check it out." "No way." Ethan crossed his arms stubbornly. "Whatever's going on, it's probably better if we stay put." "And do what?" "Wait for whatever that is, to come closer." She gestured toward the trees, though the figure had vanished. Or maybe it had never been there at all. Either way, the feeling of being watched lingered. Ethan hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and caution. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, but we stick together, okay? And if anything weird happens, we run back inside." They crept off the porch, their footsteps crunching softly on the gravel driveway. The tapping grew louder as they rounded the corner of the house, leading them to the backyard. What they found stopped them both in their tracks. A single wooden plank lay propped against the side of the shed, vibrating faintly as though struck repeatedly by an unseen force. Beside it, scrawled across the weathered surface in jagged letters, were words carved deep into the wood. "Don't look behind you." Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. Ethan stared at the message, his face pale beneath the moonlight. "What the hell?" he murmured. "That wasn't here before," Sarah said, her voice barely audible. "I'm sure of it." "Yeah, well, someone must have put it there," Ethan snapped, though his tone lacked conviction. He glanced over his shoulder nervously. "Maybe some pranksters messing with us. Pranksters who cut the power and killed our phones." Sarah shot back. "Does that sound normal to you?" He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Instead, he reached for the flashlight app on his phone, only to remember it was still dead. "Great. No light. Just perfect." "We need to go back inside," Sarah urged, tugging at his sleeve. "Now." But as they turned to leave, the tapping started again. This time, it wasn't coming from the blanket, was echoing from directly above them. They looked up simultaneously, hearts pounding, to see a dark shape perched on the roof. It crouched low, its silhouette distorted and elongated, almost insect-like. For a split second, Sarah thought she saw glowing eyes staring back at her. "Okay, that's it," Ethan said, backing away quickly. "We're leaving, right now." They bolted for the front door, slamming it shut behind them and locking it hurriedly. Inside, the house felt eerily quiet. The absence of electricity making every creak and groan of the old building seem amplified. Sarah leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, while Ethan paced anxiously. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This can't be real." "It's real," Sarah replied grimly, "and whatever it is, it knows we're here." As if on cue, the emergency alert notification flashed across her phone screen again. Somehow, it had turned back on, but only partially. The battery icon showed 0%, yet the screen flickered weakly, displaying another cryptic message. The signal is stronger here. Ethan snatched the phone from her hands, staring at it incredulously. How is this even possible? Your phone was completely dead. "I don't know," Sarah exclaimed, her patience fraying. "But it's telling us something. Something bad. Or maybe it's just glitching," Ethan countered, though doubt crept into his voice. "Phones mess up sometimes, right?" "Not like this," Sarah said firmly. "And besides, what about the message on the shed? Or that thing on the roof? You saw it too, Ethan. Don't pretend you didn't." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension hung heavy in the air, broken only by the distant hum that had returned, the same droning noise from earlier. Except now, it pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. Then came the knock. One sharp rap against the front door made them both jump. Sarah clutched at Ethan's arm instinctively, her nails digging into his skin. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. No response. Just another knock, louder this time. "Don't answer it," Ethan whispered urgently. "Just don't." But the knocking persisted, growing more insistent with each passing second. Each thud reverberated through the house, rattling the windows and sending shivers down their spines. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter and approached the door cautiously. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Ethan hissed, following close behind her. "You can't open it." "I have to," she replied, her grip tightening on the knife. "If we don't find out what's out there, it'll just keep coming back." With one last deep breath, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Nothing. The porch was empty. No figure, no creature, just the cold, silent night, stretching endlessly before them. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched remained stronger than ever. And then, from somewhere deep within the darkness, came a voice low, guttural, and utterly alien. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice from the darkness lingered in Sarah's mind, long after they had slammed the door shut again. It wasn't human, not entirely. The guttural tones were distorted, layered with an unnatural echo that seemed to reverberate through her very bones. Ethan stood frozen beside her, his face pale as chalk. What was that?" he stammered finally, breaking the suffocating silence. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, clutching the kitchen knife tighter. Her hands trembled slightly, but she forced herself to stay calm for both their sakes. "But whatever it is, it's not leaving." Ethan glanced toward the windows, where shadows flickered erratically, despite the absence of wind outside. "We can't just sit here waiting for it to come back," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We need a plan." "A plan?" Sarah shot back, incredulous. "Like what? Call the cops? Our phones are dead, remember?" He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay, fine, but we can't stay trapped in this house forever. We'll go crazy if we do." Sarah bit her lip, weighing their options. She hated to admit it, but he was right. Staying inside felt safer, but it also made them sitting ducks. If they wanted answers or even a chance at survival, they would have to take action. Slowly, she lowered the knife and exhaled shakily. "All right, let's figure out what we're dealing with. But we stick together, no splitting up." They began by searching the house for anything usefuler: flashlight, candles, matches, anything that could provide light or protection. The old wooden beams creaked ominously underfoot as they moved through each room, every sound amplified in the oppressive quiet. In the hallway closet, Sarah found a dusty camping lantern tucked away on a high shelf. Miraculously, it still worked when she turned the switch, casting a weak yellow glow across the space. "This should help," she said, holding it up triumphantly. But the small victory did little to ease the tension coiling in her chest. As they continued their search, Ethan paused near the living room window, peering cautiously outside. "Do you see that?" he asked suddenly, pointing toward the backyard. Sarah joined him, squinting into the dim light cast by the moon. At first, she saw nothing unusual, just the familiar outline of trees swaying gently in the breeze. Then movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the woods, stepping slowly into the open yard. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by invisible strings, and its head tilted at impossible angles, snapping sharply left and right as though scanning for something. "Is that one of them?" Ethan whispered hoarsely. "One of who?" Sarah demanded, though deep down she already knew. Whatever had been watching them earlier hadn't come alone. Before either of them could react, the front door rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to force its way inside. They stumbled backward instinctively, hearts hammering in unison. The noise stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against their ears like cotton wool. "It knows we're here," Sarah murmured, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her pulse. "It's playing with us." Ethan grabbed a baseball bat leaning against the wall and gripped it tightly. "Then let's stop being toys." With no other choice, they braced themselves and opened the door once more. This time, the porch was empty, but the air felt heavier, charged with static electricity that prickled against their skin. Beyond the railing, the yard stretched endlessly into shadow, broken only by the faint glimmer of moonlight reflecting off dew-soaked grass. "We need to get to the shed," Sarah decided abruptly. "There might be tools there, or maybe even a way to fix the power. And if there isn't," Ethan countered skeptically, "then at least we'll know we tried." She snapped, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Standing around doing nothing isn't going to save us." Reluctantly, he followed her down the steps and into the yard. Every step felt like wading through molasses. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on their shoulders, making even simple movements exhausting. As they approached the shed, the droning hum returned, louder now, pulsating in sync with their racing heartbeats. Inside the shed, chaos reigned. Tools lay scattered across the floor, some bent or twisted beyond recognition. One wall bore fresh gouges, as though claws or something sharper had torn through the wood. But amidst the destruction, Sarah spotted something strange. A series of symbols carved crudely into the far wall. They glowed faintly, emitting a sickly green light that pulsed rhythmically. "What the hell is this?" Ethan muttered, staring at the markings. "I think," Sarah hesitated, tracing one of the symbols with her fingers. "I think these are warnings, or maybe instructions." Instructions for what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled out her phone, again the same device that had inexplicably turned itself on earlier, and held it up to the symbols. To her astonishment, the screen flickered to life once more, displaying a single line of text. "The signal feeds on fear." Ethan read the message over her shoulder and frowned. "What does that mean? Fear feeds the signal?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted grimly, "but I think we're about to find out." As if on cue, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. Low growls echoed from somewhere nearby, growing louder with each passing second. Outside, the figure from before loomed closer, joined now by others, dozens of them, all moving with the same unnatural gait. Their glowing eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto the shed like predators stalking prey. "We need to move," Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. But as they bolted outside, the creatures surged forward, cutting off their escape route. Trapped between the shed and the advancing horde, Sarah realized they had only one option left: fight. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she raised the lantern high and hurled it toward the nearest figure. The glass shattered on impact, spilling flames across the grass. For a moment, the creatures recoiled, their unearthly form writhing in agony as the fire consumed them. "It works," Ethan exclaimed, swinging the baseball bat wildly at another approaching shape. "Keep going." Together, they fought their way through the swarm, adrenaline fueling their desperate struggle for survival. Each blow landed with a satisfying crack, sending their attackers stumbling backward. But for every creature they felled, two more seemed to take its place. Finally, they reached the edge of the property, lungs burning and muscles screaming in protest. Behind them, the horde closed in, relentless and unyielding. Just as hope began to fade, Sarah noticed something glinting in the distance: a metal gate leading to the main road. Beyond it, headlights illuminated the night, signaling the arrival of help. "Over there," she cried, pointing frantically. "Run!" They sprinted toward the gate, dodging grasping hands and leaping over fallen bodies. The Carter Sheriff's cruise screeched to a halt just as they reached the barrier. An officer jumped out, shouting orders and firing warning shots into the air. "Get in," he barked, gesturing urgently. Without hesitation, Sarah and Ethan dove into the back seat, slamming the doors shut behind them. As the cruiser sped away, Sarah looked back at the house, now engulfed in shadow. Despite their narrow escape, she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly left the danger behind. Because as the vehicle disappeared into the night, the symbols etched into her phone screen flashed one final message: "It's still with you." The sheriff's cruiser sped down the narrow road, tires screeching as it swerved around sharp turns. Sarah clutched the backseat tightly, her knuckles white from the strain. Behind them, the horde of unnatural figures pursued relentlessly, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness like lanterns in a storm. Each jolt of the car sent her heart racing faster, but she forced herself to focus to think. "What do they want?" Ethan shouted over the roar of the engine, his voice trembling with panic. "Why are they following us?" "I don't know," Sarah snapped, though deep down she suspected the answer had something to do with the symbols on her phone and the shed wall. The message still burned in her mind. The signal feeds on fear. The officer driving glanced nervously into the rear-view mirror, his jaw clenched. "Hold on tight. We're almost to the station." But before they could reach safety, the creatures surged forward with impossible speed, cutting off the road ahead. One of them leapt onto the hood of the cruiser, its distorted face pressing against the windshield. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that clicked together like broken machinery. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of grinding metal and guttural growls. "Get it off," the officer yelled, slamming on the brakes. The sudden stop threw everyone forward, but the creature remained firmly planted on the hood, pounding its clawed hands against the glass. Ethan grabbed the bat he'd brought from the house and swung at the window, trying to shatter it. "We have to get out of here." "No," Sarah shouted, grabbing his arm. "If we leave the car, we're dead." Instead, she turned to the officer. "Drive. Just drive straight through them." He hesitated for a split second, then floored the accelerator. The cruiser surged forward, ramming into the trees blocking the road. Bones crunched beneath the tires, and eerie wails filled the air. as the horde scattered momentarily. But even as they broke free, Sarah knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. They reached the police station moments later, skidding to a halt in front of the building. It was an old brick structure, dimly lit by flickering emergency lights powered by a backup generator. The group bolted inside, barricading the doors behind them with whatever furniture they could find. For a brief moment, there was silence, just the sound of their ragged breathing echoing through the empty halls. "We need to figure out what these things are," Sarah said, pacing anxiously, "and how to stop them." The officer nodded grimly. "There's a radio room upstairs. If we can get a signal out, maybe someone can help us." As they climbed the stairs, Sarah noticed the symbols carved into her phone screen glowing faintly again. This time, however, they weren't static. They shifted and rearranged themselves, forming new words. "They are not alive. They are echoes of your past fears." Her stomach churned as realization dawned. These creatures weren't just random monsters. They were manifestations of her own fears. Every doubt, every regret, every nightmare she'd ever suppressed had taken physical form, and now they were hunting her. "Sarah," Ethan's voice pulled her back to reality. "Are you okay?" She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's me. They're coming for me because of everything I've been afraid of." Ethan frowned, confused. What does that mean? How is that even possible? Before she could explain further, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. The creatures had breached the barricade. "We don't have time for this," the officer barked, ushering them toward the radio room. Inside the small, cluttered space, the officer frantically worked the controls, attempting to establish contact with anyone outside the town. Static crackled through the speakers until finally a faint voice responded. "This is Sheriff Reynolds. Identify yourself." "It's Officer Grayson," the man replied, relief flooding his voice. "We're trapped in Willow Creek. There's something here. Hostile entities. Request immediate evacuation." The line went silent for a moment before the distant voice returned. "Understood. Helicopter en route. ETA 15 minutes. Hold your position." 15 minutes. That felt like an eternity. Outside the radio room, the sounds of destruction grew louder. Doors splintered. Glass shattered. The creatures were closing in. "We need to buy some time," Sarah said, gripping the knife she'd carried since leaving the house. "I'll distract them." "No way," Ethan protested. "You're not doing this alone. It's my fault they're here," she argued, her tone resolute. "I'm the only one who can end this." Before either of them could argue further, she stepped out into the hallway, holding her phone aloft. The glowing symbols pulsed brighter, drawing the attention of the nearest creature. As it lunged toward her, she shouted, "Look at me. I'm right here." The others followed suit, surrounding her in seconds. Their glowing eyes bore into hers, feeding off her fear. But instead of backing down, Sarah focused on the source of her terror, the memories she'd buried so deeply. She thought about the accident that had claimed her parents' lives years ago, the guilt she'd never forgiven herself for. She thought about the countless nights spent lying awake, paralyzed by anxiety, and she faced it all head on. "You don't control me anymore," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I'm done being afraid." With those words, the symbols on her phone flared blindingly bright, emitting a high-pitched frequency that reverberated through the building. The creatures screamed in agony, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke before vanishing entirely. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the lights flickered back on, and the hum that had plagued them since the beginning faded away. Ethan rushed to her side, pulling her into a tight hug. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But Sarah didn't feel victorious. As she stared at her phone, the screen displayed one final message. The signal is still active. The silence in the police station was deafening. Sarah sat on the cold floor, her back against the wall, staring blankly at her phone screen. The message still glowed faintly. The signal is still active. Her hands trembled as she clutched the device, unable to shake the feeling that they had only delayed the inevitable. Ethan crouched beside her, his face pale but determined. "You did it," he said softly, trying to sound reassuring. "You stopped them." "Did I?" Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. She glanced around the room at the shattered windows, overturned furniture, and scorch marks left behind by the creatures. "It doesn't feel like it's over." Ethan hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever those things were, they're gone now. That has to count for something." But Sarah knew better. The signal hadn't disappeared, it was still out there, lurking just beyond their understanding. And if the symbols were right, it fed on fear. As long as people carried guilt, regret, or doubt within them, the threat could return. Worse yet, it might find someone else to torment next. Officer Grayson entered the room, his expression grim. "Helicopters landing outside. We need to move quickly." Sarah nodded numbly and allowed Ethan to help her up. Her legs felt heavy, as though every step drained what little strength she had left. The group made their way outside, where the helicopter blades whipped up a storm of dust and debris. Its searchlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the desolate town below. For a moment, Sarah paused to look back at Willow Creek's own last glance, at the place she'd called home. It wasn't the same anymore. The streets were eerily empty, the houses dark and lifeless. Even the trees seemed twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Something about the scene filled her with an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for her home, but for the innocence she'd lost tonight. As they climbed aboard the helicopter, Sarah noticed Officer speaking urgently into his radio. His words were muffled by the roar of the engine, but one phrase stood out. "Other towns, same reports." Her stomach churned. If what he said was true, then this wasn't isolated to Willow Creek. The signal had spread her, perhaps. It had always been everywhere, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Once airborne, Sarah leaned against the window, watching as the town grew smaller beneath them. Ethan sat quietly beside her, his usual bravado replaced by a somber quietness. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They both knew the truth. Surviving didn't mean winning. Hours later, they arrived at a nearby city shelter set up for evacuees. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Sarah collapsed onto a cot while Ethan went to gather supplies. Despite the chaos around her, the crying children, hushed conversations, and distant sirens, she couldn't escape the weight pressing down on her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the glowing eyes of the creatures, heard their guttural voices, whispering her name. When Ethan returned, he handed her a cup of water and sat down beside her. "We'll figure this out," he said firmly. "There are people working on scientists, experts. Whatever that thing is, they'll stop it." Sarah wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The signal thrived on human emotion, feeding off the very fears that define them. How could anyone fight something so intangible, so personal? That night, as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed once more. Startled, she grabbed it and stared at the screen. A new message blinked into existence. "Fear never truly disappears. It simply waits." Her breath hitched. Was this a warning, a taunt, or something else entirely? Before she could process it further, the message vanished, leaving the screen blank again. In the days that followed, life began to regain some semblance of normalcy for everyone except Sarah. While others tried to move on, she found herself haunted by memories of that night. Shadows seemed darker, sounds louder. Even laughter felt fragile, like glass ready to shatter at any moment. One evening, as she walked through the crowded streets of the city, she overheard snippets of conversation. A man talking about strange lights in the sky, a woman describing eerie noises coming from the woods outside town. Each story sent a chill down her spine, reminding her of the horrors she'd faced. And then, standing at a crosswalk, she saw it. Across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, was a figure, its head tilted unnaturally, snapping sharply to meet her gaze. For a split second, their eyes locked, and she felt it again, that suffocating weight of being watched. The light changed, and traffic surged forward, blocking her view. When the cars cleared, the figure was gone. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding wildly. She told herself it was impossible she was imagining things, but deep down, she knew the truth. The signal hadn't ended